All right, folks, welcome to the first lecture for History 310B. Before I get into the material, I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Dave Dolph. You can call me Dr. Dolph if you like. You can call me Mr. Dolph. You can call me Dave. Doesn't particularly matter. A little bit about myself for those of you who we haven't met yet. Pardon me, my educational background. I have a degree in history and Russian East European studies from the University of Waterloo. I have a master's in the history of international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and my PhD is from the University of Alberta. My thesis was talking about the creation of the United Nations organization and how that was a factor in Soviet foreign policy in the transition from the wartime alliance to the early Cold War. And so this course aligns very much with my interests. This course was more or less created for me to teach. I've taught it several times now, and while I'm always looking to tweak it, this is certainly a subject that I enjoy talking about a great deal. In terms of work experience, I taught a little bit back at U of A, but I've mostly taught at UVic. Taught a course last year at SFU, but mostly taught at UVic. I first started teaching out here in 2005, so I've been teaching here for quite a while. And a number of you probably know me from other courses. Able to teach Soviet history course, Vietnam War, and World War II, a number of other courses as well. Just a little bit about my personal life, not to bore you, but some of this may be a little bit relevant to you because some of this may affect you a little bit, is my wife and I just welcomed our second wonderful daughter less than a month ago. And so we've got an older daughter who's still not quite 2. So with a newborn and 2 children under 2, I never ever sleep. And I may be slow getting back to you on emails some of the time. I do my best. My general policy is I try to respond to all emails within 48 hours, and I do my best. But also, occasionally, I don't meet that timeline, and also occasionally I just miss entire messages. I get a lot of emails a day, and it's fairly... it's not at all unusual for 1 or 2 to slip through the cracks. If you haven't heard back from me in 48 hours, you would be helping me rather than an annoyance if you resent your email or something like that. Because, like I said, I don't always hit that 48-hour mark, but I do most of the time. So if I haven't responded by then, there's probably means I probably won't be responding at all. So again, just that's a little bit about me. I'll also introduce you very briefly to my coworkers with whom I share my home office. That's these 2 here, Sully and Emma. You may hear them in the background some of the time. They're not typically that noisy most of the time, but they're not silent most of the time either, so you may hear them from time to time in the background. If they get really loud, I'll pause things, but I don't know how much you think this job pays, but I don't have a lot of other space to record this, and again, being at home is certainly helpful with 2 kids under 2. And so, I apologize if it's a bit of a distraction, but hopefully it's not anything that would be too bad. So, to start, this course will be looking at U.S.-Soviet relations in the latter half of the 20th century during the period that we loosely refer to as the Cold War. Now, the term Cold War originally was coined way back in the 14th century by a medieval Spanish writer, Don Juan Manuel. And of course, that Cold War, he wasn't talking about the United States and Soviet Union because there wasn't a United States or a Soviet Union yet. He was talking about the hostility between the Christian and the Islamic world. However, the Cold War, the term as we know it, this rivalry between the Americans and the Soviets, the free market versus communism, this came into popular usage very shortly after the Second World War, just as the Cold War was getting going. The term is almost as old as the conflict itself. The term was originally coined by Don Juan Manuel way back when, but it was originally used to refer to this particular conflict by the British author, some of you may be familiar with him, George Orwell. And George Orwell published an essay in October of 1945 called You and the Atomic Bomb. And in the essay, he warned that the world was becoming a, quote, peace that is no peace, end quote. And instead, it was going to turn into a Cold War. And as I said, he published this in October of 1945. So this is 5 months after the end of the Second World War in Europe, 2 months after the end of the war with Japan. As we'll see in this course, tensions between the Americans and Soviets were already starting to develop in this period, although they weren't generally recognized by the public at the time. So it was quite interesting that Orwell picked up on it then. But he sort of, like I said, he referred to the conflict he perceived as arising as a Cold War. The term quickly caught on in Britain and the United States, hence we use it a lot in English. There was a very influential journalist by the name of Walter Lippmann, who was, he was a pundit. He was this wasn't TV era, but today he would be Oprah or somebody like that. He was, somebody who, Rush Limbaugh or whatever. I'm not trying to pick anybody at a particular spot on the political spectrum. I just mean he was somebody who was very influential. He was an opinion writer, and his opinion carried a lot of weight. And he wrote a book called The Cold War in 1947, again, as things were becoming more well known to the public, and that really helped cement the term in the English-speaking world. The term was also used in the Soviet Union, but not to the same extent. There, things tended to be, it's not that they had a different word for the conflict as such, but it was often framed much more in a struggle of socialism versus capitalism, rather than a struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States per se. And so again, it's not that a Russian wouldn't know what you were talking about if you said the Cold War, but they didn't necessarily use, like I said, the terminology wasn't necessarily used as widely. In any case, the term Cold War is used by us to refer to the intense rivalry for political and economic influence between the United States and the Soviet Union in the latter part of the 20th century. It gets going, as you'll see in this course, it doesn't have a clear start date, but it gets going in the sort of mid to late 40s, and then it winds down in the late 80s, and then, of course, the end of 1991, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved, and there can be no more Cold War after that, although the relationship between the Americans and Soviets had really improved so much by then. The Cold War was, practically over before that. So the Cold War, there was this intense political and economic rivalry, competition for influence in the world between the United States and the Soviet Union. As well, it had a significant military dimension. There was high military tension. There was a massive arms race to try and attain military superiority, or at least prevent the other side from getting military superiority. And it was often sort of seen as this even race. In hindsight, the Americans had a significant head start, and the Soviets never really managed to close the gap. And the Soviets were often acutely aware of this during the Cold War, but the Americans didn't really seem to be. They often felt like they were falling behind, even though, as I said, they had a head start and never really lost their lead. But that's, again, perceptions at the time can be a lot scarier than reality in hindsight, and it's perhaps a common feature in history. This struggle for superiority between the two sides is often referred to at the time and since, referred to and thought of as a zero-sum game. That is, a situation wherein a gain by one side automatically means a loss of equal degree to the other side. And that just makes the stakes that much higher. Again, a zero-sum game, there can be no new, there can be no new interest, new power, new gains introduced into the system. It's a closed system. So think of it, to put it in monetary terms. Imagine if you and I were the only people in the world, and we each had $50 for a total of $100. The only way that I can get $51 is to take it from you, and so you have $49. And the opposite, or not the opposite, but the contrast of a zero sum is a positive sum game, where I could start with $50 and you could start with $50 and you could invest it wisely and turn it into $70, and I could invest it not quite as wisely, but still okay, and I could turn it into $55, and so now the total is higher than 100. That's a positive sum game. But the Cold War, rightly or wrongly, was viewed as a zero sum game. Anytime the Americans made a gain, it was a catastrophe for the Soviets. Anytime the Soviets made a gain, it was a catastrophe for the Americans, or at least perceived as such. Since for most of the conflict, both sides had nuclear weapons, direct conflict between the two superpowers was always unlikely. In 1947, there was a French philosopher and political scientist named Raymond Aron, and he gave his famous formula. I think Harper mentions in the text. You don't need to worry about him if his name isn't up on the slides. Not something you need to worry about unduly. But Aron, he wrote his famous formula: peace between the United States and the Soviet Union was impossible, and yet war was improbable. It wasn't absolute that there could not be any war, but particularly once both sides have nuclear weapons, and as the delivery systems for those nuclear weapons, as well as the power of those nuclear weapons, keeps improving, it becomes very, very unlikely that either side would be willing to use them for fear of retaliation. And we'll talk about this idea of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction and so forth a little bit later on in the course. So again, the situation where it said peace was impossible, yet war was improbable, which is, again, a very almost unprecedented situation in world history, and that's why the Cold War is in some ways a very unique phenomenon. However, we should be careful not to exaggerate the improbability of war. Of course, we now know that war didn't happen, but they didn't know that at the time. And at several stages during the conflict, there was plenty of influential people on both sides who advocated all-out war and said, well, we're going to fight sooner or later, so we might as well do it now. And they said you got this from lots of high Soviet officials, you got this from lots of high American officials at various times. And so the level of fear was often very high. Again, once people believe that war is inevitable, there's a lot of temptation, a lot of pressure to start the war at a time of your choosing rather than waiting for the enemy to strike first. And so, again, it's peace impossible, war improbable is a good formula, but like I said, at the time, war perhaps did not seem quite as improbable as it might have seemed in hindsight. Also, as the Harper text says, the two superpowers often fought indirectly by backing different governments or different factions in various conflicts and struggles all over the world in different times and places. Now, these are typically traditionally referred to as proxy wars. Now, that is the faction or the movement being backed by the superpower was a proxy. Ho Chi Minh was a proxy for the Soviet Union. The Contras in Nicaragua were a proxy for the Americans. I don't like the term proxy wars, and that's why I put the question mark there, because I really don't think that I don't think that bears very close scrutiny. I don't think it does enough credit to the locals involved. The Americans thought Ho Chi Minh was a Soviet proxy, but he wasn't. Moscow wasn't giving him any orders, and if they had, he probably would have given them the middle finger. He had a very clear idea of what he wanted, and it was useful to be an ally. It was useful to be an ally of the Soviet Union, but he didn't want the Soviets bossing around, and he certainly didn't want the Chinese bossing him around either. And by the same token, the Nicaraguans, the Contras, you talk about them, and you could talk about anywhere else. You talk about Vietnam, you could talk about Korea. The Koreans weren't fighting the Korean War because the Americans or the Soviets wanted to. They weren't killing each other for Soviet or American aims. They had Korean reasons for fighting the Korean War. And then the Americans and the Soviets, to varying degrees, the Americans much more than the Soviets, got involved in and sort of made this local dispute into a much larger dispute. And that's the the general sort of pattern is, again, the Americans and Soviets don't necessarily create these conflicts that are these so-called proxy conflicts because the rest of the world aren't American or Soviet puppets. However, once the superpowers get involved, then local problems get bigger, more complicated, and generally bloodier as well. And they become a way for the superpowers to play out their rivalry without shooting at each other directly, because if they start shooting each other directly, who knows where it ends? It might end with nuclear warfare. So it was fairly convenient to fight these indirect wars. The term I like is limited war. Pardon me, the Soviets and Americans get involved in conflicts, but with particular limitations of how involved they will actually get. So I use the word proxy war in the slide here, and you'll see it in the text. You'll see it a lot. It's definitely worth being familiar with. But the main thing I want you to take away from this is don't just think of, like I said, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Angolans, the whoever, as patsies who are being pushed around by the Americans and the Soviets. They're players in this too, and they have their own interests. Pardon me. Now, traditionally, political scientists, and this is an international relations course, so it's a history course. It's not a poli-sci course, but we'll probably use tools from poli-sci, on a semi-regular basis, and I'll try to explain them as well as I can if we do. Traditionally, political scientists talk about a difference between core interests and vital interests. Things that matter to you a whole lot are core interests, and on the other hand, you have peripheral interests, which are nice if you get them, but not nearly as important. And one impact of the Cold War, and this goes back to the zero-sum mentality that I talked about in the last slide, is it sort of more or less erases that distinction. Once it's a zero-sum game, things that happen in places that in previous centuries would have been considered areas of limited significance, Vietnam being a good example, Afghanistan being an even better example. How much did anybody out in the United States care about Vietnam until the communists tried to take it over? How much did anybody in the Soviet Union or the United States care about Afghanistan until the Soviets looked like they were trying to take it over? And so, again, the Cold War zero-sum mentality and the proxy wars and these limited wars, these conflicts elsewhere in the world, they sort of combine to make the superpowers interested in all sorts of conflicts all over the globe, even if there isn't any sort of economic or other obvious reason why they might want to do so. Finally, before moving on, I'll just draw a little bit of attention to a term I've already used a few times, which is the term superpower. By the 19th century, the European system, international system, was heavily based on shifting balances among several great powers. You had Britain, you had France, you had eventually Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Russia. Exactly who is a great power and who was a middle power is sometimes debated. But basically, the Europeans had a balance of power system, really back hundreds of years. But it was a big part of the concert of Europe after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And if you're not familiar with those terms, don't worry about it. But once we move into the Cold War era, we no longer have a balance of multiple powers because we have two countries who are far and away more powerful than anybody else. That's the United States and the Soviet Union. Hence, those are the two superpowers. Britain still had, Europe still had powers. Britain was arguably still a power. China was definitely emerging as a power, but none of them were anywhere near the military or political might of the United States or Soviet Union. The two superpowers were sort of in a league of their own, and that's why we have the particular term to refer to them. They have far more geopolitical influence than anybody else. So that's a little bit of terminology. In terms of content, I'm going to start this course the way that countless books, including our textbook, and countless courses about U.S.-Soviet relations have started. And that's perhaps a bit paradoxically, we're starting with a guy who has nothing whatsoever to do with the Cold War, and that's Alexis de Tocqueville. And who he was a historian and a thinker. He's sometimes credited as being a founding father of political science. I've heard him referred to as a founding father of sociology. I've also heard Max Weber and others referred to as the founder of sociology. But he was, as I said, a 19th century thinker, and who said this very famous thing here. And again, you can read it now if you'd like, but obviously we'll read it. I'll say it verbatim a little bit later on. Who he was de Tocqueville. He was born in 1805 to an aristocratic family in the Normandy region of France. He enters the French Parliament in 1830 at the ripe old age of 25, where he almost immediately manages to piss off both the conservatives on the right and the reformers on the left. He's a fairly clever guy, but he's not good at making friends. And he irritates just about everybody quite quickly. He's clearly sharp, but he irritates a lot of people quite quickly. And so in 1831, he is chosen to go on a fact-finding mission to the still relatively youngish country called the United States of America. And his job essentially was to see how their prison system worked. Again, the French are trying to reform their own prison system, and the Americans are talking about democracy and freedom and all these sort of new ideas. And so they say, okay, let's see how the Americans run their prison system, and what are they doing? Do you think it's working? Do you think it's not working? Well, somebody's got to go to the United States and check. This guy's smart, but nobody likes him. Let's send him. So that's who de Tocqueville was. So he goes to the United States. He writes his report on the prison system, but he basically just sort of became fascinated with lots of other things in the United States. And upon his return to France, after, as I said, he hands in his report on the prison system, he writes a book called Democracy in America, which, as you see here, was published in 1835. And in it, he wrote these words, which have, as I said, been so heavily quoted during the Cold War. There are now two great nations in the world which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Each seems called by some secret design of providence one day to hold in its hands the destiny of half the world. So, you can probably imagine why this quotation is cited so frequently. He seems to be predicting the Cold War over a century before it begins. It kind of makes him look brilliant in hindsight. This is sort of fairly debatable. What de Tocqueville was actually thinking about when he wrote this remains highly unclear. But one possibility is that he noticed that both countries, both the United States and the Russian Empire at the time, they had gradually grown larger and larger, spanning their respective continents, and would probably continue to do so. And he was perhaps not discounting the possibility that eventually they would start bordering each other physically and butting heads directly over territory. Remember, at the time, the Russians controlled what they called Russian America, later referred to and now part of the United States, Alaska, which of course, brought Russia a bridge into North America. And we may talk about, I don't think we'll talk about this too much in the course, but the Russians didn't necessarily intend to stop at Alaska. They came down the west coast. They passed through. They made a very half-hearted attempt to set up a colony on Vancouver Island up at Nootka Sound, although they were rapidly outmaneuvered by the British, also to some extent by the Spanish, and they set up trading posts all down the west coast. The furthest Russian base the furthest Russian trading post is about 100 kilometers north of San Francisco, down in California, northern California. And Russian goods were found even, way down into Mexico and whatnot. So again, it's possible that he was foreseeing a situation where they would have a common border and actually start fighting alongside it. Also, this thing about starting from different points. Russia, the Russian Empire, was czarist. It was autocratic. The Americans were talking a great deal about democracy, which was I don't want to say an entirely new idea at the time, but actually trying to implement these policies was still how could one actually go about building a democracy was still very much a practical question. And so they certainly have very different internal systems. Each is growing fast, and will probably, and he was predicting they would both gain in power until eventually they might start butting heads. They, having said that, there was no particular reason to see the countries as inevitably hostile to one another. Basically, and this will be sort of the main point of today's lecture, is basically the Russians and the Americans got along just fine at the start. At the time of the American War of Independence, the leader of Russia was the Empress Catherine II, Catherine the Great, and the Russians don't get directly involved in the American War of Independence, but she liked the idea of the United States separating from the British Empire just fine, and this was based on her calculation of Russian interests. She said Russia was part of the European balance of power, Britain was part of the European balance of power. She didn't want Britain to be too powerful a rival within Europe, and so she figures, okay, if Britain loses their valuable colonies in the Americas, if you subtract the United States from the power of the British Empire, then Britain will become weaker and therefore less of a rival to Russia. Russia will be stronger in comparison if Britain is weaker. And so, in Catherine's mind, the United States splitting from Britain was seen as a way to help maintain a balance of power that she favored. From the American perspective at the time, in the early years when building a United States seemed like a bold and radical idea, anyone that wasn't against them was for them. Russia was willing to trade with the United States without any particular restrictions, and so great. That means we can be friends. They said anybody who's not my enemy is my friend. Was kind of the attitude of the new state back in the day. Now, for more than half of the 19th century, more than half of the 1800s, including the time of de Tocqueville's writing, this is the main sentiment that persisted. Pardon me. The United States, of course, won its independence. Didn't give dates in the War of Independence, but we're talking about the late 1770s, early 1780s. And as we progress into the 19th century, again, basically they got along fine on the principle of common interests. Here we have another quotation that seems to sum things up very nicely. In 1824, Count Karl Robert Nesselrode, Karl von Nesselrode, his middle name was Robert. He was the Russian foreign minister from 1816 to 1856, which is an incredibly long time to remain in a senior cabinet post like that, particularly when the new emperor or empress can fire you anytime. Well, I guess the 19th century has to be emperors, but they would fire them anytime they felt like it. And so to stick around for 40 years was really quite a remarkable feat. It's perhaps even more remarkable because he did it without ever really learning to speak Russian. Pardon me, he came from, there was a number of aristocracy in the Russian Empire of German descent, and that's, his family had originally been French and then became German aristocracy under the Russian crown, yeah, he was a very shrewd guy, and so, like I said, he served as foreign minister for a very long time. And he said, pardon me, in 1824, fairly early in his tenure, he said, this quotation we see here, it would be best for us to waive all discussion upon abstract principles. We must endeavor to settle the differences between our governments on the basis of mutual interest. So what he's saying is, let's not talk about ideas like Tsarist autocracy versus American democracy, those sorts of abstract principles. Let's talk on the basis, what do I want, what do you want, what are our interests, and let's see if we can make them line up. And for the most part, they lined up pretty nicely, which made it fairly easy for the two countries to get along. They both had mutual interest in preserving a balance of power, which would last mostly until the late 1800s. During the American Civil War, which of course ran through the early part of the 1860s, during the American Civil War, the Russians were the only major European country to support the Union, to support the North under Abraham Lincoln. And again, this wasn't based on ideological or moral issues like slavery. The American Civil War was not a crusade to end slavery. It's a little bit confusing because the South, the Confederacy, was fighting to preserve slavery, but the North, at the start of the war, had no intention of getting rid of slavery. It's complicated. But basically, the Russians weren't supporting the Union, supporting the North because of, as I said, moral issues, but as talked about already, over practical issues. The Russians wanted the Americans to be part of the balance of power. They wanted the Americans to be a possible counterweight to British power. If the United States split into two countries, the North and the South, then each one of these would be weaker, and therefore they wouldn't be able to play their role that the Russians wanted for them in the balance of power. And so, again, on the basis of common interests, the two countries got along just fine for most of the 19th century. The Russian-American relationship fell quite neatly into the dominant American foreign policy at the time, what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was originally proclaimed by the fifth President of the United States, James Monroe, in 1823. In short, under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States foreign policy towards Europe was predominantly based on the idea of trade without political entanglements. So they didn't want to have allies and enemies in Europe. They wanted to do business with everyone, but they didn't want to pick sides in the conflicts that the Europeans always seemed to be fighting. Russia was entirely willing to handle the relationship on this basis. That yeah, we can trade as much as as much as there's an economic interest to do so, without any formal political or military agreements, without any alliances. So that suited the Americans just fine. The other part of the Monroe Doctrine is the Americans didn't want the Europeans to create any new colonies in the Americas. They were afraid of the U.S. the Americans were afraid of the Europeans retaking control of some areas in the Americas, and that might eventually threaten the United States. And the context of that, again, the Monroe Doctrine is penned in 1823. By this point, most of Latin America has won its independence from Spain or Portugal, as the case may be, by this point. Most of Central America, Mexico, Central America, Mexico, of course, North America, but Mexico, Central America, and South America, had all basically won their independence from European powers, and the United States is saying, now that they're independent, leave them be. Don't come back and try and retake them, because again, they didn't want the European great powers encroaching in what they were sort of hoping would be their backyard. Perhaps I should unpack that a little bit there, said hoping it would be their backyard. Again, now we tend to think of the United States as dominating Latin America. That starts only in about 1900 or so. It was more, as I said, back in the time of the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps Monroe might have been thinking ahead to a time when the Americans would be able to assert a lot of influence over their Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking neighbors. But primarily, as I said, they were afraid that if the Europeans come back, if they start adding if Mexico became a colony again, well, that colonial power might start going after American territory or territory that the United States wanted because they're still in the process of moving westward and so forth. And so, again, that was the Monroe Doctrine in short. The Monroe Doctrine is usually referred to as isolationist, but I never think that's quite an accurate description because the Americans were certainly willing, as I said, to trade with everyone. They weren't North Korea trying to cut themselves off from the world. They just didn't want to, as I said, they didn't want to pick sides in a war. And so the Monroe Doctrine sort of has these two things. We'll trade with Europe without getting entangled, without having friends and enemies. And we'd really like it if you stay out of our hemisphere here. And again, those are what the Americans wanted, and that suited the Russians just fine. Again, the Russians weren't interested in creating any new colonies in the Americas at that time. By that time, Alaska was the only colony. It was quite clear that Alaska was the only colony the Russians were going to get in the Americas, and that only lasted until 1867. 1867, Alaska, Russian America, or Alaska, was sold to the United States for the whopping sum of $7.2 million, which worked out to less than 2 cents, which worked out to less than 2 cents per acre, or about 2 cents per acre. I'm not sure if it's a little more or a little less. And that figure of 7.2 million, the Russians were quite happy to get that amount of money for it. They were hoping to get at least 5 million. So they did quite a bit better than they thought. Sometimes this is treated as, in hindsight, this is treated as the Russians being stupid and the Americans being bright, because Alaska has a lot of mineral wealth that's worth, multiple times what the Americans paid for control of Alaska. It's not really that simple. The Russians knew that Alaska had resources and was probably going to be valuable in the long term. But the Russians are saying, how much is it going to cost us to get them out? To get stuff from the northern tip of North America and bring it all the way across the frozen part of Russia to Moscow and the place, St. Petersburg, the places where the cities are, the places where most of the people are, is just going to be too difficult and too expensive. We're never going to be able to afford it anyway. They needed a lot of money up front at the time, and so they figured, okay, it's why hold on to this in the hope that someday we'll get some money out of it. We might as well, get some use out of it right now by getting some cash in hand. So the point I'm trying to make here is, for most of the 19th century, even though the United States and the Russian Empire were internally very different, Russia, the things that de Tocqueville highlighted Russian authoritarianism, whereas American political culture was focused on these idealistic ideas of liberty, this would only really matter later. By the end of the 1800s, by the latter part of the 19th century, the relationship is starting to cool off. One reason for that is ideology starts to have more an effect on international relations in general. Again, there starts to develop the idea, which is still, I think, fairly prominent today, that how a country behaves internally will influence how it behaves in terms of foreign policy. And so if they have a bad internal system, that will make it difficult to cooperate with them, and they'll become a problem later on. And that's just an idea that starts to sort of gain traction in the European and the Western world in the latter part of the 19th century. And so part of the rising tension between the Americans and the Russians in the latter part of the 19th century is just part of a broader trend. Pardon me. Beyond that, there were significant geopolitical issues, China being a very important one. In the late 19th century, lots of European countries were picking on China, but the Russians were the only ones in a geographic position to actually take over Chinese territory directly, take it away from China and add it to their empire. The British and the French had sort of zones of influence, and sort of the Germans and some others in China, but it was difficult to actually make most of China outright colonies. I mean, Portuguese got Macau and the British got Hong Kong, but China was too big really to make the whole thing a colony, but for any one of the European powers. But the Russians could chop off chunks and add it to their empire because they had a common border, and that's what you see on the map right here. The Russians start horning in on parts of western and northern China, also areas. It's now a country of Mongolia, which was disputed at the time. The Uyghur territories that are again in the news quite a bit recently. The Russians kind of had their eyes set on that, although they've never managed to actually get it. Pardon me. So the Russians started taking territory over in sort of western and northern China, and they start horning in on more, particularly the area, and again you can see it marked on the map here, the area known as Manchuria, which was just south of what the Russians call the Russian Far East, or the Amur provinces. Pardon me, the city of Vladivostok and pardon me, as I said, the Russian Far East there. Manchuria had quite a few natural resources, and again, it already has a common border, so it seemed a very logical area for Russia to try and expand their influence into. The other area, again, geographically close to what they already controlled, was Korea. Korea was nominally under Chinese rule, but the Chinese really didn't exert too much influence there at the time, and that perhaps left them vulnerable to a European great power. And so Russia was, as I said, clearly sort of horning in on Chinese territory. Now, the Americans, again, talking about why this is causing tension between the Russians and the Americans objected to this from sort of two standpoints. First of all, there was the anti-colonial standpoint. The American perception, self-perception, was that the United States was a British colony that broke away and became free and then built this wonderful country. And so they were sympathetic to other countries that didn't like being under European domination. That's the U.S. will wield a lot of imperial or neo-imperial power later on, but certainly that's this American self-perception is they were on the side of the colonized against the colonizer. And so in general, they'd be sympathetic to China versus Russia. On a more practical level, the more European influence there was in China, the harder it was for American companies to make a profit there. Again, economics at the time, the different European empires had fairly high tariff walls, and so if they take over, if they have these zones of influence in China, or in the case of Russia, if they take over Russian territory, or Russians take over Chinese territory directly, then it'll make it harder for the Americans to do business there. And the Americans then, as now, always liked doing business. And so the Americans were lobbying hard for what was referred to as the open door in China. They thought they could do just fine as long as everybody had equal access. But if Russia starts carving out territory, then Russia's getting privileged access to certain parts of China. So for both of these reasons, there was. China becomes an issue in the Russian-American relationship that contributes to the deterioration of relations, just as the general trend was also contributing to a deterioration of relations there. Now, as I mentioned, the Russians wanted to take over Manchuria and Korea. Problem is, so did the Japanese. And this led to a war between Japan and the Russian Empire, cleverly called the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. This opened, as I said, 1904. The war began with a Japanese surprise attack on the Russian naval base in Manchuria called Port Arthur. The Japanese struck completely by surprise at the naval base without a declaration of war, and the Americans said, "Good job, what a clever thing to do. That's a great way to start a war." Which is perhaps a little bit ironic given what happened a few decades later. And in general, there was, again, the Americans didn't get directly involved in the Russo-Japanese War, except to try and end it. But that's a point that we don't need to get in here. But public opinion in the United States during the war was definitely pro-Japanese rather than pro-Russian, which is, again, kind of an indication of how the relations between the two countries had soured. Pardon me. Another factor that contributes in American public opinion, negative public opinion towards Russia developing in the late 19th century is anti-Semitism. Russia had long been regarded as having a long tradition of anti-Semitism, but this became much harsher in the late 19th century. There were legal restrictions on Jewish people in the Russian Empire that had largely ceased to be enforced and had sort of fallen by the wayside. And they start to, in terms of which part of the country they could live in and how many Jewish people could go to universities, and again, common anti-Semitic stuff you see in a lot of part of the world, in lots of parts of Europe at different times. And as I said, this starts to get actually enforced a lot more in Russia in the latter part of the 19th century. As well, you see a real increase in what were referred to as pogroms. Jewish people in the Russian Empire tended not to be very integrated. They tended, if they were in the countryside, they lived in a Jewish village. If they were in a city, they lived in the Jewish neighborhood of that city. They didn't live side by side with Russian neighbors, very little intermarriage, and these sorts of things like that. And so pogroms were just open season on the Jews. They were just attacks on Russian villages or frequently Russian neighborhoods within cities. Russians, there was a lot of them, and often there were Poles and Ukrainians as well. But they were just sort of, like I said, go into the Jewish community, steal anything they want, smash anything they don't want, beat a bunch of people up. Sometimes people would be killed, and they're not talking about millions of deaths like the Holocaust, but murders were not at all uncommon. Rapes were fairly common as well. And so again, it was just open season on the Jews in the Russian Empire, and this was something that was actually encouraged a little bit sort of clandestinely, but a little bit clandestinely, not very clandestinely. It was sort of encouraged by the Tsarist government in Russia at the time, because by this point, Tsarist authoritarianism isn't very popular in Russia. There's a lot of political discontent. And so a few of the later Tsars figured, okay, well, wouldn't it be great if we could get all these angry people to blame their problems on the Jews rather than on us, the Tsars? And so, like I said, they tacitly encouraged this anti-Semitism as a way of sort of reinforcing their political position. Now, the U.S. diplomatic corps was relatively successful in protecting the rights of American Jewish people in Russia, and there weren't a lot of American Jews in Russia. There were a lot of Jews leaving Russia to go to the United States. There weren't a heck of a lot going back. So it wasn't that attacks on Americans per se were an issue there, but the general repression, the fact that there was outright violence that was tolerated, as I said, even subtly encouraged, or not so subtly encouraged by some of the last czars, led the American government to send several notes of protest, which were basically ignored by the Russian government. Russian government said, yeah, how many Chinese people you let move into the United States? And how exactly do you treat your black people? So you think you're going to lecture us about racism? We know what the conditions are in our country, and you got no right to tell us what to do. So, like I said, relations between the United States and Russia were good for about the first century or so, perhaps a little bit less of the United States, but by the late 19th century, the relationship is breaking down. There wasn't anywhere near the hostility there would be during the Cold War. There was no real threat of war or anything like that. They still maintained diplomatic relations. They still did a little bit of trade, but they weren't really friends. The term that is often used in political science or in diplomacy for a situation like this is their relationship was correct but not cordial. They said they didn't hate each other, but they certainly were not friends. And that, I think, is a good place for us to end our first lecture.